It started in my town. In 2024, random bodies were going missing out of the 4 local cemeteries, with reports of people digging up the remains for body parts, but especially skulls and bones. Except for a few bones kept as sinister mementos, only pieces of flesh were stripped away, leaving nothing but tooth marks. There were suspicions of people taking them as trophies, or some type of morbid curiosity, but why would anyone ever eat scraps from the bones? There were no indicators of who and why they were taken. As far as we know, there were no reports going back to colonial times, and nor did the native population have any rituals involving cannibalism. Every night, the local cemeteries were filled with people with flashlights and video cameras, all looking to catch the guilty in the act. The police had to frequently conduct patrols of the area to keep people away. Even during the day, there were people who would show up looking for evidence, and eventually, the cemetery was closed off. It was taped up, and signs were put on all the trees and on the fence line to tell people not to enter. A warning. However, people still wanted to place flowers on the gravesites of their family members, so people were occasionally granted access, only sometimes to discover a beloved family member or dear friend had been some of the ones who'd been dug up and consumed. There were even talks of families waiting with guns, ready to protect the graves, even people who had never bothered previously with their dead family members. It changed how people related to death. If anyone died in the town, they'd be buried elsewhere, sometimes completely out of state, or they'd end up being cremated to prevent this from happening. I'm related to some of the remains who were taken, distant relatives who were barely a memory. It was only when I found out the body of my cousin had been dug up that I was personally affected. She died in 2019 and was buried in my family's plot. Sophia was buried in her favorite dress, and it had been torn away from her body, her rotting parts pulled out, and her bones scraped of skin and flesh. What remained after that was taken away as evidence. My auntie couldn't stop crying for days, months, inconsolable with grief, and I found her crying, hair ungroomed. She hadn't eaten. She had become a recluse. The grief was too much for her, and soon, my last living family member also passed away. The sight of her lifeless body at her funeral only made me more angry. A bit of backstory. There was an old funeral home close to one of the cemeteries who used to manage most of the burials and funerals of people in the local area before the final family member passed away. They were a beloved part of the community. They were trusted by everybody. All of the other funeral home businesses would go bust through a lack of business and a sheer lack of community trust. There were 2 main buildings. One was the business side, where they dress and store the body, and their primary residence were both left abandoned. Surprisingly, the local children never went inside to explore, nor vandalize the place, so it was left to decay without any disturbances. The building didn't remain quiet for long. There was a video posted with a ghostly figure leaving the old funeral home, and they made their way past the graves, then through the barricaded front doors of a mausoleum, and left empty-handed. They soon found a grave, seemingly at random, and lowered themselves down, digging up the remains and eating chunks of flesh before whatever it was went back into the house. The video was dismissed as a predatory prank, but through the power of the internet, it was spread, and now both locals and tourists would show up, looting and destroying the pieces while laughing and posting content about it. The townspeople had enough. There was no answers, and nothing was being done. There was no trace of whoever the figure was. It was insane. The mausoleum attached to it was also ransacked, and the community started conducting vigilante justice when they saw people from out of town. I've never seen anything like it. Teenagers, adults, and even boomers would carry baseball bats, and even a few would openly carry firearms. All quite overkill in my opinion, but I understood why. I, however, discovered the answer without meaning to. I was walking down the road to the local corner store, a couple of streets away from the local cemetery, St. Joseph's, the one where it all started. It was 5 a.m., and I was finishing up my graveyard shift at the community hospital where I worked with a coffee in hand. The area was normally safe enough to walk home, and at dawn, I doubted anyone would be out late at night. Even the local vigilantes usually never came out this far. In my peripheral vision, I saw a group of people standing together in the tree line. Our cemeteries have a long circular driveway with black iron gates and were lined around the edges with tall pine trees that protected the privacy from the road. Thinking perhaps I knew them, I lazily waved at them and kept going until I noticed something wasn't quite right. They didn't walk. They didn't walk upright. Instead, their torsos hung loose and their arms dangled on the ground. Their gait was a loose shamble. I turned and looked over my shoulder at them, condensation coming from my lips, and I stopped when they noticed me. I started again and they followed me. This time their pace was faster. The streets were still deserted, and I suddenly wished that I drove my car. They kept going, and their bodies were grey. They snarled and came close to the fence and finally pressed their bodies against it, reaching through. What were they? I shrieked when a hand gripped my shoulder and jumped, throwing my drink in the air, and turned to Carol, the confused and equally concerned pharmacist, opening up to begin the day. Embarrassed, I apologized several times and picked up my cup. I told her I saw people in the cemetery, and she told me it should be closed still. It was probably people checking it out, trying to worry people, and I agreed. We said goodbye. She lifted the loud door up, opened the glass doors, and the bell jingled. I looked across the road and saw they were gone. I made my way home and didn't take any detours. I got home to my small studio apartment and closed and locked the door behind me, threw my bag on the couch and opened the fridge door, staring into it, and took out last night's pizza to eat for breakfast. I put the box on my bed, went and gave myself a quick shower, and settled in to watch a movie and relax. I lay on my stomach on my bed with my laptop screen playing some brain rot. I ate some of my pizza and started to doze off. When my phone began to beep, I blinked and woke up. It was the next morning. I slept through the entire day and night, groaning and rubbing the sleep from my eyes. I looked at my phone and saw it was 5 a.m. One beep, two beeps, and an endless cycle began with new notifications coming through, countless messages and phone calls. I checked my phone and saw it had been blowing up with calls, messages, and different social media posts. More footage was discovered this time by a group of teenagers who entered the cemetery, the same one I had been across from. Again, nothing worth going viral over. 5 of them ran through the graveyard, jumping over graves and shouting with flashlights moving everywhere. They laughed and shouted and filmed near the old funeral home. There were growling sounds, and those same grey figures shambled over, hands and arms outstretched. At first they laughed, shining the light in their eyes, and the ghouls cowered away, shielding their faces. They got closer and filmed them, reaching over and attempted to pull the mask from their faces, only to realize it was skin. The laughing died and they stood, staring. completely dumbfounded. Soon one of the strangers reached out and took a bite out of one of the boy's arms, leaving a trail of blood and living flesh between the broken, twisted teeth, and soon more were attacked. The video ended there, but there were more. It wasn't the only one. There was another showing the gruesome bite wounds in front of me. There were debates about whether it was from a human or not. It was terrifying to think it could have been me who had been bitten. Instinctively, I wrapped my blanket around me and ran my hands over my arms. The different theories were wild now, and there was a curfew where all the residents had to be inside, with no exceptions, bar emergency services. Over the weekend, people watched from their windows, keeping each other updated concerning any changes that may arise. Unfortunately for the gaggle of gossips, there was nothing. The online groups kept the community in touch. All the boys who had gotten scratched or bitten were taken to the hospital, with their wounds becoming septic. No antibiotics were working, and the poison from the bites was something medicine had never seen before. Each of them soon fell into a coma. Their families no longer permitted to see them. Circulating around the different groups was a blurred image of them laying on a hospital bed in quarantine, kept away, and days, then months passed with no news. People said the medical staff were all forced to sign NDAs, and thus were not able to speak more on it. Next, a blurred video, made in haste with a phone, was put online. First, it was put on one of the less frequented video platforms, and finally YouTube, with snippets on others. It spread like wildfire. Hello, I'm Nurse Norris. I'm a nurse here at St. Joseph's. I need to show you what's happening to the patients. The video moved across the clear and thick panels, looking in at one of the boys, now strapped down to the bed. His skin was grey, lifeless, and clumps of his hair had fallen out, leaving his head with gaping sores. He pulled on the straps, snarling and snapping his teeth together. What would cause something like this? This is what they've been hiding. I don't know what to do, but the government is here in secret. They've locked us down. Please, help. She turned the camera back to face her, her eyes red with tears, and she shook her head. What's happening here? What's happening? I could hear sounds of screaming and fighting, but I couldn't see what was happening. I hope someone can find the answer to what's going on. The video ended sharply when the nurse was approached by a man in a suit. I had to go back to work, but I received a message from my supervisor telling me I wasn't needed back again. The entire hospital was under lockdown, and only restricted personnel were permitted to enter. The town was quiet before the break-ins began. People would try to break in first at night, and then during the day. Pets started to go missing, only to be found half-eaten later. Videos were being posted online, asking the wider community for answers, but that was when people realized they were no longer hearing from people outside the town, and they could only communicate inside. One of the last messages I saw before the internet itself went down was how some people were planning on fleeing the town to get to safety. Crazy Bill, the resident hermit survivalist, gave a speech in the middle of town in defiance of the curfew, and gave the community one final warning. It was terrifying to think how the world was overturned, where people were actually listening to him. I heard my neighbors outside get in their cars, packing everything they had into their sedan or Range Rover, and drive down the road. I wondered whether I should have done the same when I peered out the window, the blinds hiding my face, and I sank back down on my bed again. Were we some kind of experiment? What caused it? Was it some kind of parasite? Later that night, the sound of a car pulling into the neighbor's driveway caused me to get up and dash toward the window. The Range Rover parked, and the Weiss returned, hanging their heads low and rushing inside the house. The Bellingers and their sedan were nowhere to be found. I had an uneasy feeling of what could have happened to them. I checked my phone. No connection. And I tried sending a message only to have it not go through. I groaned and pulled my hair, pacing around the room, trying to think of what I should do next, and none of the ideas that came up made any sense. I needed to know what happened. I took my keys just in case, and left, and casually jogged over to the door, standing visibly in front of the camera, and pressed the doorbell, not wanting to be mistaken for one of them. I heard them pick up, and soon the sound of Mrs. White's sobbing voice came. Then she gave a muffled hello. I waved a hello to her and asked if I could come in. Hey, I don't think that's allowed, honey. And I don't want you to get in trouble. I wasn't sure why I'd be in trouble. I don't think it's a good idea for you to stay here. Please, go back to your place. I'm sorry. What happened to the Bellingers? They didn't come back. She paused. I don't know. They tried to drive through the blockade. I think one of them got shot. We drove back when we saw it. We were both quiet for a bit. How could this happen? Go back. I'll talk to you later. Have you seen any of them? I shouldn't need to explain who they were. Go home. The door slammed in my face. With no answer, I debated going to another neighbor's house to see if they knew anything. I looked down my street. Normally there'll be children playing or people walking. Instead, an eerie silence had taken hold. And that was the worst part. I walked back through the empty lawns and went back home, closed the door and locked it behind me. Resting my back on the door, I went to my bookshelf and browsed the different dust-covered books. I trailed my finger in front of me, trying to find something to absorb myself in, despite what was happening around me. I figured a zombie story would be in bad taste, and nor did myths and legends spark my interest. I settled on a general one about history, picked it up, wiped the dust off the top, and flopped on my bed. As I read, I started to notice a disgusting smell, and wrinkled my nose trying to ignore it for a moment, when it became unbearable. I put my book down, went into the bathroom and checked in there. I flicked on the light. Everything was as clean as I had left it, and there was no clear source of what it could have been. I went to the kitchenette to check the garbage disposal, peering down into the sink and sniffed. Not the source of the smell. I opened the fridge. All the meat inside was fine, and I heard a shuffling behind me, a shadow moving, and I knew I wasn't at home alone. All the air went out of my lungs and I eyed up the kitchen knives in front of me. I knew a human figure was standing behind me, and it was the source of the horrid aroma that tormented my nostrils. I took the knife in my hand, shakily turned, and saw a grey-skinned woman. Her clothing was in tatters and reeked of the grave. Her curly hair hung down her shoulders, and she stood barely up to my shoulder. Her lips were drawn up, revealing either missing or pronged teeth. I backed into the cabinet and waited for the inevitable attack that did not come. She remained where she was, still with that expression, and I realized it was a smile rather than a sneer. I gave an awkward, strained grin back, based in fear rather than friendliness. Yet, she hadn't made any attempt to hurt me in any way, other than being creepy and smelling bad. A clawed hand gestured for me to sit with her at the small table, and I was in no position to refuse. Still holding the knife, I sat down with whatever this was, and waited. I regret how things have gone. She spoke, husky and hoarse. It was a start. My children are hungry and need to feed. Your children? I asked, finally able to respond. I had too many questions coming into my mind. The Wiley family would aid us, allowing us to feed discreetly without worry of being seen or come to any harm. She explained the Wiley families were the ones who owned the funeral home, all until the last family member passed away. While I enjoyed this explanation, I wasn't sure why I was being told or what I could do to help the situation. I remember them, I added, unhelpfully. Do you know what they used to do? She asked, a curious tilt of her head, and I wondered whether I was dreaming. Maybe the isolation was getting to me. They were the keepers of the dead, our guides and guardians. They would feed us and protect us from the living. In turn, we didn't feed on the living and kept them safe. What does this have to do with me? There aren't any Wileys left now. She curled a finger, gently tapping in my direction, and I hated that gesture. Your family are connected to the Wileys. What are you saying? You must take up the family's mantle. And if I don't? Her otherwise peaceful yet horrifying smile twisted into a malicious grin. Her eyes looked on mine. Then we devour the entire town and beyond. It hung in the air. I thought about the Wiley family. They were isolated, keeping to themselves, unless they were conducting business, and otherwise known for being quiet. I didn't think about what could have happened to them. My mother told me my great-great-grandmother and theirs were cousins. I didn't want to work inside a funeral home, not to mention deal with whatever these were. I guess I don't have a choice, I answered, and she stood up and offered her hand to me. Still holding the knife, I reached over and placed my hand in hers. I expected her to bite my hand or scratch. However, her grip was surprisingly gentle, and the pair of us walked through the street. From the windows, I saw curtains being pulled to one side, and people looking out at me. No one, from my knowledge, did anything to intervene, and we walked to the cemetery. We walked past other ghouls. They fumbled and made low growling sounds as we passed, before they followed us back through the iron gates. I noticed some still had fresh blood dribbling from their mouths. We walked toward the funeral home. No need to open the doors, because they had already been broken previously, and carefully I stepped through the glass. Seeing the damage in person was surreal. Curse words were sprayed all over the walls. Furniture had been broken, ornaments were destroyed, and papers thrown all over the floor. I looked around, but I was led in through the back way. The old coffins were pushed to one side and spray painted over. Water dripped down from drains or damage, I'm not sure. It splashed as we walked through, and I had goosebumps. I lifted my shoulders to protect myself from the sharp cold. We continued down the cold hallway with barely any flickering light. Even if I was able to, I doubted I'd be able to stop them from swarming me and devouring my flesh. The tunnel work changed to heavy brick, no doubt from when the town was first settled, and deeper now. There were no more bricks. Instead, it was cut into black, shiny stone. On an altar were piles of human bones, some still with dried skin, and rotting pieces of clothing on them. I slowed my pace barely a little, and I felt her grip tighten, keeping me in pace with her. We walked closer till we were barely a foot away. It was only when I glanced down, I noticed there was a circle of dark, murky water surrounding us, lined with multiple human skulls of varying sizes. My breathing echoed throughout the enclosed space, and finally, she released my hand. Here are the Wileys. A hand gestured to their remains, and I was confused. Why would they treat them like this? They gift us their flesh and bone to aid us. After all, a pledge was made long ago, and you will do the same. She offered her hand to me, waiting for me to place mine in hers again. I didn't like the idea of someone eating my flesh, but the thought of them destroying the town was too much. Wincing, I closed my eyes, trying to pretend it didn't exist. But finally, I opened them, taking it all in, and finally extended my hand to caress hers. She lifted it up. A black slimy tongue licked the palm, leaving a mark on it, before a filthy fingernail sliced down my wrists. I screamed, trying to push her away, but her deceptive strength held me close to her. I kept my uncut wrist close to my chest. She yanked me over to a large bowl, dribbling my blood down into it, and slowly the strength left my body. The tips of her nails dug into my skin, and finally, she released my hand while I clutched it tightly, trying to stop the bleeding. She scraped her hand along the table and gathered dust, fragments of dried bone, and scratched onto the wall. She stirred this concoction together and sank a goblet into it, lifting up the liquid and offered it to me. I shook my head and heard more of them hobbling around us in a circle. Choice denied to me. I accepted it, swallowed a mouthful, dreading to taste the contents, and felt the end tip upward, causing me to consume more of the foul drink. I vomited it up, retching, and soon I was on my hands and knees on the floor, emptying the contents of my stomach. I wiped my lips, stared up at her, and other than feeling sick, I didn't feel like there was any difference.
"Put them to rest,"
she commanded, unhelpfully.
"If you don't, you will lose their respect."
I was scared to think what would have happened if I didn't have it. What? Get back! Go to rest! I weakly ordered them, not believing it myself, and they gazed at me with ravenous, unblinking eyes. Shakily, I pointed back in the direction of the tombs, more insistently this time. "Now! Get back!" I demanded, and they froze, groaned and turned, leaving the room. Stumbling, I looked at the Ghoul Queen in confusion. I followed them down into the pit and watched as they crawled into their crypts, curling up into a fetal position, and their bodies returned to a dead state, dreaming. The space took on an eerie silence, finally at rest, without the anger I had grown accustomed to from them. A faint raspy breathing told me that the Queen had joined me.
"Follow me,"
she bid, and I complied. We went above ground, and the daylight stung my eyes. I blinked, squinted, and used my hand to shield them. I felt an almost itchy sensation when I looked across the horizon. They were moving, wriggling, and I realized some of these were more frantic than others.
"Call them back home, Crypt Keeper."
I exhaled, closing my eyes to focus, and imagined reaching out to them, pulling them, luring them to return with my mind, and called the rabble back to their dwelling. I sensed them moving toward me, an uneasy scratching feeling in the pit of my stomach. During the dreadful wait, I realized how quiet the town had become. No cars nor people made noise. I wondered if there were any survivors left. They stumbled through the gates, some of their clothing covered in dried blood, and some with flesh dangling from their lips. I saw a hand twitch in one of their mouths. Clearly for someone, I was too late. They moved past me, traveling deep into the earth, and one by one, I felt them fall into a deep slumber, their minds finally quiet. I knew I wasn't finished yet, and there were more who didn't return to me. Without any guidance from the Ghoul Queen, I walked out the gates and saw a world filled with carnage and death. The gardens were overgrown, cars abandoned with doors open, with stray suitcases, showing people had attempted to flee in a panic. The curfew had clearly failed. The homes and businesses had open doors, some off their hinges, and others had broken windows. Walking through the streets, I wondered how many people were still alive. I found some of those who lingered. Their legs had been severed and left thick blood in their wake. A couple of them protested and were unwilling to drop the remains of an out-of-towner who had probably been drawn in by the reports, and were unable to leave when lockdown started. Finally, I convinced the stubborn ghoul to make his way back to the crypts. The progress was slow, and I watched it crawl, knowing I'd be waiting a while for it to make its journey. The progress was slow, and I watched it crawl, knowing I'd be waiting a while for it to make its journey. I had a feeling a group of them were corralled together somewhere, only they were completely unable to move. Peering inside a window, I saw a group of living deadheads moving on the ground, and seated across from them was an older man, his ball cap concealing his face. Draped across his lap was a rifle. He was murmuring words under his breath that I couldn't make out, and I decided to come back later for these ones. I'd need to think of a way to carry them back to their resting place. I couldn't feel where the rest of their bodies were either. I felt a sharp pain in my chest. My hand rested on it, and realizing the source came from a distance away, I ran through the deserted streets until I found a space between two houses. 3 people surrounded a ghoul wearing balaclavas and were stabbing or bludgeoning it. Blood and broken bones was everywhere. The ghoul was in pieces, barely clinging together, and yet it still lived. The ghoul snarled, scraping itself along the ground in a foolhardy attempt to escape.
Punish them,
I heard her hiss, angry and commanding. Ignoring her, I didn't want more humans to die. Anyway, the ghouls weren't a priority of mine, but I needed to put them to sleep. I needed to put an end to this. "Stop!" I called out, and the 3 turned to look at me, then at each other, and I suspected they hadn't seen anyone alive for some time. "I'm taking them back to the crypt so they will sleep. I don't think you can actually kill them. Let me try this." Now that I said it out loud, I knew how ridiculous it sounded. They looked at each other, questioning what I said, and turned their weapons to me. "I can communicate with them. Please, this is the only way," I pleaded, hands outstretched to show I was unarmed. I saw the hatred in their eyes, believing me insane, or a traitor, siding with humanity's new enemy. One stepped forward, struck down near me with a bat, and fortunately, they were only aiming to scare me away. The ghouls scurried away, and they seemed to understand, or at least accept. Maybe they too were just fed up with all the death. I just need them to go back to the crypts, the cemeteries. If they don't do this, it will spread, and only get worse. We entered into an uneasy stalemate, the ghoul who made its way, and the armed men. Throughout the next days, the undead returned to their graves, their crypts and their places of rest, and the survivors gradually came out of hiding, except for the more resilient and untrusting ones. Then I saw the men in suits, the same one from the video long ago. They watched me leading the ghouls back to the graveyard and didn't approach. One of them raised their hand to their ears, and they spoke to whoever was in charge. They assisted me when I went to get the ghoul heads back from the defensive old man who swore, twitching and rambling to himself about how we were making a big mistake, that it would cost us, that we were fools. I watched as he was taken into custody and prayed he wouldn't be put to death. At a town meeting, the surviving members of the community were briefed on the cover story we were going to go with, whether we liked it or not. It turns out the government had quarantined the town, and strangely, they already knew about the ghoul population. With all of them down below, I was given the old house owned by the Whaley family, and started decorating it to make it my own. I figured if I was stuck doing this, I would at least be happy and comfortable where I was staying. Boxes surrounded the floor, and I was sorting out the cutlery into the kitchen drawer when I noticed several cars driving by. New families were moving in. The town was being restored, bribes given, threats issued, and life was returning back to normal. Already the first natural death had occurred. I conducted the funeral service and discreetly carved meat from the corpse. You wouldn't have known there had been any disturbances to the graveyard. Everything had been restored, with the dead respectfully placed inside fresh coffins. The remains had been found and returned to rest. Fresh gardens had been planted, and there were new headstones to replace the old ones. The past was swept under the rug. It wasn't solely where I now resided, but the other cemeteries too. Thankfully, the town didn't have to deal with any angry ghosts who desired revenge. Everything was getting back to normal. The survivors would all politely greet each other on the streets, acting like nothing had ever happened, both out of a blind desire to move on, and to not get kidnapped at nighttime and dragged away. No one was sure where they went, but everyone knew that they never returned.
I need you down here.
I heard the Ghoul Queen's whisper and wince. I took a flashlight and walked over to the mausoleum, unlocked it, and worrying about people breaking in wasn't gonna happen anymore. People learned to respect the dead. I walked down the stone steps. The aroma of the dead no longer bothered me anymore, and I could sense them all deep in slumber, rarely waking to feed a little or to be guided back to rest. I went into the inner sanctum and saw the Ghoul Queen standing there, clearly waiting for me to arrive. Yes? Is everything okay?
It's time for you to take control and rise in your position.
I didn't know what she meant by that. I had already done everything she asked me to do. She gave no sign, and suddenly rushed toward me and took my hands, squeezing them tightly, her eyes gripped in desperation.
Please, I want to be free.
I need to be free. I finally saw and heard who she was before. Her eyes were no longer the faded ones of the dead. There was a spark in them, a distinctly human one, and I wondered which wily descendant she was, or if she could even remember. How? What do you want me to do? She still clung to me, the same knife we used in the ritual placed in my hand. I shook my head and tried to hand it back to her. Let me rest. Let me be free. She pointed the knife toward her and forced me to stab her in the stomach, the rotted blood and entrails dripping down onto the floor, then did it again and again. We both knew she wouldn't die like this. We both knew she wouldn't die like this, and I stared down at her in confusion. You must consume my flesh. The final piece of the puzzle, she exclaimed, and I realized something. The Ghoul Queen had to be the first wily daughter. How or why this occurred, I didn't have the answer. I nodded, compelled to grant her a moment of release. I wasn't sure how much I'd need to. I cut into her arm, peeled off the skin, and closing my eyes, sinking my teeth into the flesh, and ripping off a bite. If she felt pain from the experience, I had no idea. She didn't flinch, nor did she instinctively try to fight me. I chewed mouthful after mouthful, feeling my stomach engorge with all the flesh, and I kept going. I didn't feel any different, but I did feel guilty. With every bite she began to taste different, and I realized she was changing from ghoul to human. Tenderly I lowered her down to the ground, cradling her in my arms while I feasted. Her head tilted backward, her hair cascaded down, the blood from her body went from black to red. Hour after hour passed. My stomach strained and I gazed down at my hands. All sign of blood flow had disappeared. My skin had already turned grey. I left her face intact, unwilling to destroy her beauty, and I heard her first and final breath. Soon, she would die. I think she was trying to say something to me, perhaps some passing wisdom before her life ended. I tended to her burial, and whenever I had to deal with the public, I would conceal my skin with corpse paint. My skill with makeup and wigs were great. The time I spent around people kept to a minimum, and regular feedings permitted me to remain myself. However, the company of the living no longer brought me any joy, and that was how I met the Ghoul Queen, how I killed her, and how I became the Ghoul Queen. I hope you enjoy this story. What did you think of it? Let me know what you thought in the comments section down below. Don't forget to stab the like button, subscribe, hit the bell and leave a comment. This video is made with the support of my incredible channel members. Patreon subscribers, and all my viewers. Thank you so much for supporting me. Don't forget to check out my social media accounts below, including my merch. Stay safe, my little spooklings. And remember, I'll be watching you.